Rachel Bovard.
I'm Josh Hammer.
I'm Emily Jashinsky.
And I'm Ben Weingarten.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. So welcome back, everybody. As usual, we have a robust agenda covering a number of topics of interest, timely ones too. We're going to start with Emily's discussion of the Cultural Revolution via Bureaucratic Fiat. We're going to get into the vaccine mandate and common good debate. We're going to get into ruling class rifting around Trump versus Biden. And then I'm going to end with General Milley's potential treason that just came out actually yesterday. We're recording this on a Wednesday. So with that, I'll kick it off to Emily.
Well, thanks, Rachel. So listeners know that I'm sort of regularly irritated by, because it's always at the front of my mind in our conversations, this false dichotomy between culture and economics. And we had an opportunity to see that illustrated so well, or to see the problems of that illustrated so well when President Biden last Friday cited the authority of OSHA, which is an agency within the agency of the Labor Department. He tasked them with enforcing under their authority a federal vaccine mandate for all federal employees. And then also he mandated anybody who works for a company or that a company with more than 100 employees implement a vaccine mandate. And it just calls to mind how there's sort of our bureaucracy, our federal bureaucracy is so sprawling that it now has this like latent power to enforce these very radical cultural precepts or policies that the left is now completely attracted to, and is so untethered from the check of the populace because of the way our economic system has evolved, and because of the way our hierarchy works, that they're now responsive to just this tiny slice of the population. And they have this massive bureaucracy to make those enforcements with. And so, it also, a great example of this, Title IX, when the Obama administration used a Dear Colleague letter from the Department of Education to set huge legal precedent about sex and gender, to redefine the legal word sex for schools around the country under threat of losing federal funding. And this is something that was cited, of course, in court cases ultimately. And they did that with a letter. Joe Biden implemented a federal vaccine mandate for federal employees with OSHA. And if you look at the power that was originally delegated to OSHA in its formation, it's outrageous how much power that OSHA can. That's like the big tragedy here, is that there are legitimate debates on both sides of whether this was legal, of whether Joe Biden had the authority to delegate this power to OSHA, and whether OSHA has the power to do that, because Congress has delegated a stupid amount of power to OSHA because of its own inaction and its own disinterest, as Rachel always talks about, in actually legislating. So I'm going to kick it over to the group, but I just think this case illustrated so perfectly how we have a bigger and bigger federal government and a more radical stewards of that huge government. And it's not used to nefarious ends in high profile cases every single day. But I think this should be a wake-up call for us that it will be going forward. This is a tool. This is the sort of size of our government is not entirely a distraction. It can be in some ways, talking about debt and deficit, and I understand that. But so it can be a distraction, but it's not merely a distraction. It's actually sort of their vehicle. It's a vehicle that we should pay a lot of attention to for cultural revolution. So with that, I will kick it open to the group.
I guess my question is, because I think you're absolutely right about how the left weaponizes the administrative state in ways that we just sort of never see coming. Like the really striking thing about the OSHA ruling is when you realize how broad OSHA's authority actually is. It's literally like to do anything to protect employers in the workspace. And somehow they've been sitting on that, right? Like they could be doing a lot more than they actually are. It's kind of terrifying. But I guess what is it, the right's response is to just, okay, don't pass it to begin with, but to try and recall a lot of that authority. And in so many ways, it's been unsuccessful. I mean, you still have people fighting to repeal the Department of Education. And it's like, okay, guys, like it's probably not going to happen. I mean, we couldn't even repeal Obamacare, right? When we had reconciliation with 51 votes, we had a test run in 2015, teed up for a Trump administration to sign, and we couldn't even get that done. So part of me thinks that, like, you know, and I was raised in the sort of very conservative culture of, yes, like these are the fights we need to have, or these like repeal the unconstitutional Department of Education. And I'm like, okay, but is the actual answer to just put our people into these bureaucracies? Like that is, I guess, is my open question, because what is it? If I have far less faith that this power is ever going to go away, do we fight it on two fronts? One, we fight the creation of it, of more of it. But two, we recognize that these fights have failed, right? To recall any of that power. And so instead of shunning these organizations, do we actually just like create a conservative deep state to run them? That's, I guess, like my sort of question to riff off Emily's question.
I think you're totally right that it's like an untrimmable bureaucracy. Like there really is I don't see how it's plausible to reverse it, or even how it would be moral to reverse a lot of it, because it would thrust the country into chaos. We're also very reliant on it and conditioned to accept it now.
Well, I guess my take on this, to play off what Rachel said, I mean, Rachel and I, we both spoke at Johnny Burke's ISI conference on political economy and the DC area in late July. And I actually was on a panel about the administrative state and conservatism and all this stuff. So my basic thesis on that panel, which remains my thesis in this segment, I guess, is that we can basically walk and chew gum at the same time here. We can simultaneously train our own people to effectively try to, in a Vermeulean sense, integrate from within, kind of, you know, minus the Catholic integralism part, obviously, but kind of integrate conservatism from within. You know, Rachel, if I understand the purpose of American Moment, the board that you and I are both on the advisory board of, that's more or less kind of at least part of the purpose of that organization. So I think that's a very worthy goal, and we should obviously be investing a lot of resources into that and training young conservatives to kind of come up and integrate from within, again, in a political, not necessarily theological context, just to clarify. But simultaneously, of course, I don't think it's worth wholly abandoning, you know, this kind of like Mike Lee inspired mission to reclaim more Article 1 powers here, right? As a fundamental recalibration and separation of powers. We should not kind of abandon that hook, line, and sinker as a whole scale, long-term goal for the conservative movement. I mean, this OSHA thing in particular here, they're relying on a tiny provision within a tiny provision of the actual statute. It's ETS, emergency. I can't remember what it's called, like emergency temporary standard or something like that. It's been invoked 10 times in the history of the statute, normally for like very small ball minor stuff. Think about like asbestos, like things like that. And it has never been invoked in a context anywhere remotely close to this year. It's all but assuredly unconstitutional. But to kind of get into the legal weeds here a little bit, administrative law precedent for decades and decades basically holds that if Congress delegates a, quote, intelligible principle, an intelligible standard to Article 2 to the administrative state, and they can then promulgate and effectuate rules from there. So it's kind of what Rachel said. It's basically true. I mean, OSHA is sitting on a wellspring of untapped power, but Congress has given them that, and under existing Supreme Court precedent, that probably does qualify, roughly speaking, as a quote unquote intelligible principle. That obviously is flawed as a matter of precedent. So anyway, I guess my thesis is just walk and chew gum at the same time. Let's train our own conservative deep state while recognizing that this is problematic as a basic matter of lowercase r Republican self-governance, and working towards recalibrating that as well.
So conservatives for the deep state is the takeaway, I guess, from this episode. I think what we're talking about is, I think we probably agree on different aspects philosophically in our aversion to the administrative state as an entity in and of itself. For me, I might come out on kind of the more radical and in line with like a Philip Hamburger view of the world, that I think it's probably wholly unconstitutional in toto, and thus deconstruct the whole thing. But of course, how do you practically get to that? And the practical reality is, as I think we're all sort of implicitly admitting, the administrative state is not going to decay of its own volition. So while we try to get as many jurists as we can at the highest levels of the land to ultimately litigate against the deep state, and while we also try to train people up to serve in that administrative state, to actually serve our ends. The fact of the matter is, it's not going away. I do think that there are probably tactical ways that haven't really been explored beyond the personnel as policy aspect of this, in terms of, set up alternative offices within any number of agencies and starve the existing parts of the agencies of actually being able to make policy. I mean, one could conceive of different ways tactically as a strategist that you might actually go about defanging the agencies and actually concentrating power in alternative offices within agencies that actually end up working towards the ends that we're talking about. I guess a leftist would probably say, well, why don't you try Cloward Piven of just make the agencies so big and so vast that they ultimately collapse of their own weight? And I think the administrative state ultimately might prove over time too big to succeed, ultimately in the end sought, but we might be dead before we get to that point. So all of that said, I think at the end of the day, I agree with an all of the above option of you expect that the administrative state will persist. You do everything you can to fight it using every single power that you have. But the bottom line is it's truly illegitimate. And I do think a question with respect to, two other quick points. One being, I think this reflects the fact that the left will use any lever of power they can to impose their ideology, including aspects of the Cultural Revolution and beyond, whether it's private businesses, whether it's the administrative state, or any other lever that they have, because power is truly what is being sought. And then I do think there's another question, and this will tee up the next segment for Josh, of if you assume that this is going to fail legally, and I think in my view, I think it is a very strong case that this should fail ultimately. What was the point of issuing this sort of regulation, knowing that it was likely to fail? I think that's a question that we all ought to consider, and maybe we'll do so in Josh's segment.
So real quick before we go to Josh, I just want to clarify like my initial statement, which is, one, I am a total Article 1 supremacist unabashedly. Like, I want Congress to do everything, right? But what's brought me around to this conclusion is that, one, they haven't, and two, we've built sometimes, I think, a conservative movement around a normative that just like isn't that at some point we have to acknowledge isn't happening, right? Like, how many fundraising emails am I going to get about just deconstructing the Department of Education when it's just not going away? So like infiltrating it is more of like my practical assessment of this of the case. But
I think it's always good to just remember that Rachel is a socialist.
The conclusion of every argument.
Well, if you believe the Koch brothers funded tech people, then Rachel is obviously a commie, as are me and all of our colleagues. But anyway, let's move on to the vaccine mandates and the common good. So obviously, this is kind of an ancillary discussion. It plays directly off of what we were just talking about here. So look, I don't want to get like too deep in the weeds here as to kind of substantive notions of what the quote unquote common good is and how that necessarily plays out. That we could spend like literally hours probably riffing on that, and we're not going to get to that in this segment here. But just like a few quick points to kind of make at the top, and then I'll throw it open for discussion fairly quickly. So we mentioned on the previous segment here, again, I apologize, I can't remember what ETS stands for. It's literally Emergency Temporary Standard or something like that. This is a small provision within a small provision of a statute from 50 years ago that's been invoked 10 times here. And it brings to mind, if I can quote this wonderful op-ed from my friend Josh Blackman, a constitutional law professor that I published in Newsweek earlier this week. He quoted this famous line that Justice Scalia said maybe 20, 25 years ago or so, before he passed away, obviously, where he said, Congress, quote, does not hide elephants in mouse holes here. So when you have kind of the executive branch reaching this deep into a statute that's been in the books for 50 years to find something and impose this kind of sweeping mandate affecting up to 100 million Americans, right? I think that is kind of an ipso facto, right off the bat notion that the common good is maybe not being served by something along these lines here. And just to kind of state the obvious here, just kind of put my cards on the table. I personally am vaccinated. I will be totally honest with you. Sometimes I do regret it, actually. I got it back at the time because I travel all the time, and like I was terrified about the airlines doing the vaccine mandates.
Can we get unvaccinated? Is that like a thing that we can do to like show our distress with the
just get Delta.
Well, so I personally, I don't know about you guys, I am drawing the line at the booster shots. I have decided right now that I'm not doing the booster shots. I have done my Moderna shot, but like, I think Israel's on like shot number 4 right now. I mean, like, where the heck does this end? But anyways, I don't want to get too sidetracked here. So just to get us back to the vaccine, to the Biden, and it really was kind of an imperial decree. I mean, I watched that press conference live. it was harrowing. It was really bone chilling stuff. Honestly, I do not think President Obama, for all of his manifold flaws, ever had a press conference that was quite as imperial sounding as that. So this entire notion that Joe Biden is a quote unquote moderate, that idea, it was dead, frankly, before Election Day last November. It is deader than dead now. So obviously, you're going to see some Republican states suing. I think Arizona has already kind of come out and saying they're going to sue. Texas usually starts these Republican-led lawsuits because they have a very prolific Solicitor General's office there. So this thing is going to get challenged in court by Texas, Florida, all the kind of leading right of center states for sure. I guess kind of the other question here, and what I wrote my column on last week, or perhaps a week and a half ago by the time this episode comes out, is assuming these lawsuits will be successful, and I'm cautiously optimistic they will be, because it is pretty flagrantly lawless from my perspective. The litigation will take time, to be sure, but I think more interesting question is, what should the conservative stance on vaccine mandates at a state level should be here? And I view it as kind of a mirror image of the big tech debate, right? I think the same people who basically say, start your own Google, who kind of take this kind of hands-off private enterprise, hands-off free business at all costs approach to the big tech regulation debates, are oftentimes the same ones saying the government should have no role in private sector vaccine mandates, right? That it should be up to each business, up to each small business, big business. On the flip side, I think the people who are generally a little more comfortable using the levers of state power in a big tech context, whether it's antitrust, common carrier regulation, whatever, oftentimes kind of take this Ron DeSantis-y, we can give Greg Abbott a little bit of credit, I guess, Greg Abbott maybe approach, basically using the government to effectively say the private sector vaccine mandates should be banned, period. And we're taking a lot of time here, so I'm going to throw it open with this real quick question. I guess something that I've written about, that Ben has written about, is this notion of this pan-institutional ruling class that is both public and private sector. It's kind of this wokest ruling class that is really trying to subjugate the deplorables, right? And if you kind of accept that conceptualization of what is currently happening in America at face value, personally, I come down on the DeSantis Abbott side of this for sure. I think that we have to effectively use mild state power to tell private enterprise to not subjugate people who don't want to get this experimental vaccine. But I'm happy to throw it open to you guys. What do you guys think the proper conservative right of center response should be at a state level, assuming this litigation against the Biden tyranny is successful?
It kind of reminds me of the CRT debate in a little bit. In some way, right, that sort of divides the movement, right, between people who are like, well, just like work it out in court, or like, see where all the chips fall. But, God forbid we like exclusively take a step to ban something. It sort of breaks down along those lines. And I admit to having like two minds about it, because again, I fall back on this like movement I was raised in, which is like, oh yeah, don't actually take an affirmative step forward. But I do think, and watching Ron DeSantis, the sort of opposite poles of this debate are kind of like the Kristi Noem approach, which immediately upon, Joe Biden making the speech, she's like, I'll see you in court. And the Ron DeSantis approach, which was, any business in my state that mandates a vaccine gets a $5,000 fine, right? Like those are the kind of the two different approaches to this question. And I honestly think, in my mind right now, when you are seeing the stakes of the debate being like, you are going to have to inject yourself with something or not, when it's that level of the debate, I think the DeSantis approach is correct, which is, I am going to take every step possible to make sure that this tyranny doesn't touch my citizens. I am not going to make them suffer under it while I work it out in court, while I wait for our like the creaking levers of the judiciary to move forward. And I just, that is kind of my instinctual response, was that the DeSantis approach here is correct, and not just because it's Ron DeSantis, but just because I think that that's like what you have to do in a case like this. But I recognize that a lot of people probably disagree with it.
What's kind of interesting about this whole conversation is that the left would probably say, well, as a matter of common good, that's why we need to have a federal mandate of this, setting aside the fact that the political reality is, to Josh's point, this is just one more cudgel to be wielded against the deplorables. And also, as we know, of course, substantial percentages of Blacks and Hispanics who likely do not vote for deplorable candidates, worth stating up front, of course. But I'm sure they would make the reverse side of this argument, which is, yeah, common good is all about public health, and the utilitarian thing is to try to mandate this for everyone. I think at least a starting point that we can say is that decisions like these ought to be made at the state and local level and not the federal level. And of course, public health is in the domain of state executives and the legislators as well. And so from that perspective, there's a strong legal and practical case to be made that the DeSantis view, or pick your red state governor's view, is legitimate, because on a matter of public health, setting aside individual choice and protecting our liberties and beyond, you can make a public health argument this way, but the left could also say at a state and local level, we make the public health argument the other way. So I think at least at a base level, we can say, or at a sort of fundamental level, we can say this ought to be state and locally determined. I tend to side more on the DeSantis side of things, because I do think at a 30,000 foot level, this should be about individual choice, individual conscience. Maybe you'll see a mass of conscientious objectors, essentially, because usually there are religious and other exemptions associated with these sorts of draconian policies. I'm sure people on the left will say, well, look, there are plenty of things that to use public institutions, to fly out of the country to certain other countries, to go to schools, you need to get certain other shots. But that said, I do think it's deeply disturbing the way that it's being implemented. And of course, the rank politics from the start of this, the flip-flopping on all the positions from the public health authorities, the attempts by elected officials to shut down any rhetoric, research, facts beyond that do not comport with whatever the ruling class position is at any given point of time. And of course, it's ever shifting. Not to mention the fact that, of course, these vaccines are all under emergency use, besides the Pfizer one, and the Pfizer one that's got an approval isn't actually available for production yet, even though it's supposedly substantially exactly the same as the one that's currently out there right now. All of those are practical reasons why skepticism is understandable, and speak further against the fact that there ought to be any kind of mandate implemented by public or private institutions.
So my lovely boss, Molly Hemingway, said something important in her acceptance speech for the Bradley Prize this week, which was published on the Federalist, about how, as John Adams, she quoted John Adams talking about how this system of government is meant for a moral populace, right? And I think we can have the conversation about the proper role of government, but I also just think the lack of social cohesion in this country, which is an incredibly difficult thing to do with a country as diverse and multicultural and massive, just frankly as massive as it is, with geographic diversity and all of that. It's not an easy thing to do, but our lack of social cohesion right now makes it just sort of renders this whole conversation about the appropriate legal decisions so odd. I mean, I love the idea, we haven't even talked about how union members are actually fighting these mandates. And it's just a fascinating thing of how, when you do feel like you're in a community and you have representation in your workplace or in your local school district or with your state government, when you feel like you have that representation, this conversation just gets so much easier, because we can delegate power to communities who can make decisions for themselves that are, will they be popular with 100% of people? No, but will you be able to get closer to some sort of consensus? Yes. And that's just where this all gets, it just all gets so difficult. There's, in my mind, it's just this whole conversation is totally frustrated by the low level of social cohesion in this country, and that's a very, very sad thing. And actually, speaking of that, we're transitioning to Ben's topic right now, which is in that context sadly poignant.
Yeah, and interestingly, I'd sort of draw an analog here to, you probably all saw the PSAs where they had Bush, Obama, and Clinton, talking about getting the jab, but of course, Trump, the person directly responsible for facilitating and fostering the development of vaccines, notably missing. And there was something similar, I thought, in terms of the split screen that we saw on September 11th, where you had former presidents at the World Trade Center site, George W. Bush, the only one to speak in a high-profile speech at Shanksville, and then President Trump making sort of an impromptu appearance with the FDNY and NYPD. And I thought that the contrast between George W. Bush and Donald Trump was incredibly striking, that split screen. One man standing with as he said, back the blue and sort of the law and order folks, the first responders that day and beyond, not doing it in the formal kind of setting with the pomp and circumstance of the other politicians out there. That the optics alone of that, I think, were interesting, sort of meeting with the rank and file folks on the ground while the other presidents attended these other sites. But interestingly, I think, was what President George W. Bush said, and that created a further contrast with deplorable America, and I think perfectly captured the sort of uniparty view of the country versus the anti-establishment, deplorable view of the country, or really the America First view of the country versus the traditional GOP establishment sort of view, which is really very linked closely, I think, when you look at the arguments that George W. Bush made in his speech and how well they coincide with the arguments put forth by the likes of a Joe Biden or a Barack Obama or a Bill Clinton, almost indistinguishable, in fact. So the first point worth making is that George W. Bush implicitly drew moral equivalence between the jihadists who perpetrated the attacks on 9/11 and the Capitol rioters. And he did this very obliquely, I think, so as not to have to really get into the weeds of it. It was not clear, for example, could he have been talking about BLM or Antifa? Unclear, but I think it's very, reading between the lines, clear that he was really talking about the deplorables. He said, quote, "We've seen growing evidence that the dangers to our country can come not only across borders, but from violence that gathers within. There's little cultural overlap between violent extremists abroad and violent extremists at home. But in their disdain for pluralism and their disregard for human life and their determination to defile national symbols, they are children of the same foul spirit, and it is our continuing duty to confront them." So he's comparing Americans to jihadists on 9/11. And really, it's the perfect bookend when you think about it at the highest level, transitioning from the global war on terror to the domestic war on wrong thinkers that the establishment uniformly seems to believe in. He also absolved himself and the ruling class he represents from the divisions that he spoke about in the speech. And by the way, why he's talking about these divisions in such a speech speaks to a politicization and a cynical politicization that I think had no place in any kind of address here. And of course, President Trump was also political in his speeches, but he wasn't speaking at Shanksville, in front of the families that he was speaking in front of. So he said, President Bush said, "A malign force seems at work in our common life," contrasting it with the day after 9/11, essentially, "that turns every disagreement into an argument and every argument into a clash of cultures. So much of our politics has become a naked appeal to anger, fear, and resentment. That leaves us worried about our nation and our future together. I come without explanations or solutions." Well, of course, he doesn't take any responsibility for the divisions that have been created in the country. He, of course, doesn't cast any aspersions on the left in any respect, but it's clear, it would seem implicitly clear that he's talking about the right, and not just because of the implicit Capitol riot reference, but because he also chose to focus on a couple other things in the speech. He noted basically that the best of America came together after 9/11, and he called out, this is two of the three things primarily that he called out: avoiding religious bigotry when it came to embracing Muslims, and avoiding nativism and welcoming in immigrants and refugees to the country. That was George W. Bush's response in talking about the country coming together and the best of the country after 9/11. And it's a clear jab, obviously, at anyone who would dare say, care about our sovereignty, care about putting American citizens first, saying, for example, like President Trump sought to implement a policy of extreme vetting, looking at the adversary as the adversary presents himself rather than in some idealized form. And of course, focusing on, sort of the politically correct response, as opposed to the fact that we ought to recognize there's evil in the world. Jihadists threatened us that day. They still threaten us today. You can imagine what a comparable speech might look like. And President Trump alluded to the disaster of our response ultimately, and the shameful end to these 20 years started, of course, with the policies of President Bush. So I think the contrast was just striking there in a President George W. Bush choosing to go after Americans in the platform that he used, and the president, on the other hand, going with the deplorable, the maligned by our political establishment in many cases, police officers, and obviously to a lesser extent, firefighters. So I wonder if anyone else found that contrast striking as I did, or if anyone else had any other takeaways from the comments around 9/11 from our putative leaders.
I can't imagine thinking this way. I really mean that. I cannot imagine thinking this way. And my only explanation is that it comes from just profound social and cultural insulation. To ever see your countrymen, and again, we talk about January 6th so much, and I can say, having covered it, that is a lot of just disenfranchised people. I have sympathy really for nobody who stormed the Capitol, broke windows, and desecrated the symbol of the Republic in that way. Symbol, and more than a symbol, the sort of like heart of the Republic in that way. But to compare it to jihadists who murdered 3,000 people, 3,000 innocent people, it's I don't know how the brain works. And to Ben's point, it was implicit, right? Like, he didn't want to get into, really talking it through. He just sort of casually gestured to it, as we've seen so often. We saw Steve Schmidt say that it was worse than January 6th was worse than 9/11. And the only explanation for thinking this way is that your brain has been completely broken. Your brain does not function in a rational way anymore, because you're so isolated, or you're so insulated from the broader public, and you're so drunk on anti-Trump, anti-conservative partisanship. And it was really sad to see from George W. Bush. And I just quickly want to say that I went and helped YAF put 3,000 flags out in the National Mall on Saturday on 9/11. And it was right in front of the Capitol. One of the last times I'd had that view of the Capitol was as I was covering January 6th, walking. And before I'd even seen what George Bush said, the thought occurred to me, like, oh, this is a much more beautiful view of the Capitol with these 3,000 flags in front of me. But who could ever think those things were the same? And so just like the in-person visual of it was sickening. And it's such a basically obvious thing.
I think something you said, Ben, is really important here, which is like, and not to overstate it, but bringing the sort of war on terror home. And you really do start to see this when, it's almost like they've honed all these tools in the desert, right? And now they can't use them over there. So they want to bring them back to like a quaint little domestic application. And you kind of see it not just in sort of postures like Bush, but like even other rhetoric, this sort of otherizing, when you have a president of the United States walk into or make a speech where he openly blames 80 million unvaccinated Americans for the deaths of people here in the United States. When it's like your neighbor is responsible for everything you cannot do. It is turning this just like divisiveness, toward the insurrectionists and the anti-vaxxers. And suddenly that creates a scenario where the ends justify the means to whatever it is that you have to do to these people, whether it's surveil them incessantly or, block them from access to public life. It is a very dangerous thing, I think, that we're seeing. And I was texting with the chief of staff for a senator, and he pointed out to me, he was like, yeah, it's really bad. We feel like we're under assault from everything. And he's like, one of the only people who understands what's happening right now is Glenn Greenwald. He's like, think about that, and this is for a Republican senator. I was like, you know what? It's not wrong. And I think, Glenn has a lot of views of this that I think are correct right now.
Yeah, we do live in weird times with strange allies. Glenn Greenwald himself had blocked me on Twitter for like 7 or 8 years, then unblocked me last December. We do live in weird times. We're short on time in the segment. I don't have a whole lot to add to what's previously been said. I guess I try to play like a little like armchair psychiatrist here and just think about what has happened to George W. Bush. I mean, let's not forget, George W. Bush was the governor of Texas, okay? It wasn't like he was like a Mitt Romney. He was a governor of a blue state. He was ostensibly the governor of the most iconic red state in the country here. And, he grew up in kind of like a patrician, intergenerational New England family, of course, but then he became a Texan. He had the accent. He kind of left mainline Protestantism and kind of became an evangelical. So he really should be, in theory, more quote unquote in touch with the deplorables. So I'm not sure exactly what has happened since he's left office here. I basically default to what Emily said. I mean, it's got to just be another case of Trump derangement. And obviously, George W. Bush was never kind of a conservative and kind of the nationalist, populist, whatever mold, obviously, but just this complete galling lack of empathy and willingness to compare the defining event of his presidency. We've all seen the video, of course, of him in that elementary school in Florida on the morning of September 11th, and like Andy Card, the chief of staff, coming over to whisper in his ear. I mean, we've all seen that video 100 times by now, right? Like, to compare that day, the defining day of his presidency, and just the evil, the profound, just true evil. I mean, like Old Testament biblical level evil that we saw there with what happened on January 6th. It's just galling. I mean, like, there really are no words. I share Emily's just complete, utter lack of ability to empathize with this.
Well, and I think as we transition to my segment, the last thing I'll say also about the transformation of George W. Bush is that he does come from this patrician family, but arguably the last sort of generation of leaders that understood this idea of noblesse oblige, right? Which is that you are to whom much is given, much is expected in terms of service, in terms of sort of grappling and serving with, the country that you have. And you've seen this evolution of George Bush into like a decrepit elite, very much like General Milley, who we're going to talk about now. But it's an amazing thing to behold in a very unsettling way. So I want to talk a little bit about some news that broke yesterday, where again, we're recording this on a Wednesday, as part of a book that came out called Peril by Bob Woodward and Bob Costa, in which they report on activities in the White House following January 6th, particularly those related to General Mark Milley, who's the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, in which he seemed to actually undermine, and I want to be very careful about saying this, but actually to undermine the commander-in-chief, the head of the armed forces, right? This country is founded on civilian control of the military, and you had the highest ranking military official begin to undermine the commander-in-chief in very specific ways. And I outlined them. I want to go through a couple of them, but he initially, after January 6th, instructed members of the military at the National Military Command Center, the oversee nuclear weapons, to not take any orders from anyone unless he was involved. Then 2 days after January 6th, he took a call from Nancy Pelosi in which she said, "President's crazy." And reportedly, the authors got a hold of the transcript of this call, which is how they know what was said. He said she said, "The president's crazy. Is there a plan for, any nuclear strike he might make? Can you do something?" And Mark Milley is reported to have said, "I agree with you on everything." And then he took steps to make sure the director of National Security Agency and Gina Haspel, the head of CIA, were on the lookout and were, instructed not to do anything until, he was there. And then even more troubling is the fact that at some point he's reported to have called China, one of the like top general in China, to be like, "Yeah, by the way, don't worry, we're not going to take any strikes or action against you. And if we do, I will let you know in advance." So here we have like two really dramatic examples of, the highest ranking general in the military taking steps to make sure the commander-in-chief cannot, do anything he wants or maintain any orders to anyone. And two, actually giving aid and comfort to China. And that's, again, definitionally, I have to think treason. When you give aid and comfort to the enemy, that's the term the Constitution uses for treason in this regard. And as I'm thinking about this, I actually tweeted this out right before this podcast, but watching the response from people, yesterday, a lot of us saw this and fell off our chairs, jaws hit the floor, to be like, I cannot imagine this happening in the United States of America, where one of the most foundational concepts of what separates us from like actual banana republics is that we have civilian control of the military, we have branches of government that are separate, all these things clearly being undermined. But watching today, Jen Psaki being asked directly about this and saying, "We have full confidence in General Milley. He wasn't doing anything wrong. We didn't have a president that was trying to foment an insurrection. We have full faith in him." Meanwhile, sort of a pretty tepid response from Capitol Hill. It's almost like Republicans are still trying to figure out what's going on. Marco Rubio's probably had the strongest statement saying, hinting at this might have been treason. Tom Cotton has called for hearings, but I haven't seen anything else, and it really just led me to believe that this is one of the biggest examples to me that we are living in a post-constitutional state, where you have something this galling that should bring together anyone who cares about preserving this republic, not to mention all these, Democrats on the or resistance liberals who were like, "Oh, we're living in a coup for the last 4 years." Like, you actually have evidence of one now. And they're like, "Oh, but Trump was really bad, so this is obviously laudable." you would think that this would be the galling thing that brings people together, but no, he's going to be rewarded for it, and no action is going to be taken against him. And I guess that's my question. Like, where does this leave us? If he's able to do all those things, and all these things are true, I have to condition a statement on all of them being true, but General Milley's put out a statement where he hasn't denied any of them. So if all these things are true, Congress does investigate and no action is taken, where does that leave us? That's, I guess, my broad existential question.
I don't have a good answer to that question. I don't know that any. That
I don't either. But
yeah, I don't know. I don't know that any of us are going to have good answers to that question. I mean, you have to wonder about the timing of this too, right? I mean, this is all dropping kind of in the middle of obviously the continued hearings with Tony Blinken being dragged before the House and the Senate with the Afghan withdrawal debacle and all of that. And this is coming out in a book, so I'm not saying that the two are necessarily directly linked, but I don't know. I mean, it's easy to see that there is a world in which this is just going to get buried because of the news cycle and all that too. It really, if the Afghanistan withdrawal thing was not still taking up a ton of headlines, this would be the scandal of the decade. I mean, the scandal, I don't want to say the scandal of the century. That's maybe overstating it a little bit, but this is to quote President Joe Biden back when he was vice president, this is a big effing deal. I mean, this is a big, big deal. There should be tons of investigations, but what happens if we don't get to the bottom of it? I mean, look, what Rachel said, I just want to underline that and emphasize that, because what she said is completely correct here. Literally, civilian control over the military, the fact that the president of the United States, who was elected by the Electoral College, which itself was elected by the people in the 50 sovereign states, the fact that the commander-in-chief, via that process, has ultimate, effectively plenary control. Yeah, plenary control. I mean, it's a direct chain of command. Plenary control over the armed forces. That is probably the singular defining feature, right, of what a democracy compared to a military dictatorship, authoritarian form of government, whatever is, right? It was arguably the defining feature at the convention in 1787 that the founding fathers sought to put in place to distinguish us, certainly from the British crown, where the king himself, was obviously not elected, but he had control over the British Army and the British Navy. So what happens if we lose that here? But I guess the other thing to bear in mind here is that obviously, this is drawing an exclamation mark along what has been really kind of a decades-long trend here, which is just the erosion of lowercase r Republican self-governance in general. And this obviously kind of gets back to our previous segment about the administrative state in general here. There's been a massive transfer of power from Article 1, that's the Congress, of course, to Article 2, to Article 3, of course. That's my judicial supremacy stuff and all of that I could pontificate on for hours now. So there's been just a huge transfer of power at both kind of the federal level and really kind of a state-by-state level, often at a state governance level as well, from state legislative bodies and federal legislative bodies to unaccountable people. And this is just drawing an exclamation mark, I think, upon a broader and more troubling trend. But ultimately, if we lose civilian control over the military, I don't think we can use the word democracy to describe America. That literally is the singular defining feature, I think.
So all I'll do is add that after this news broke, I was watching MSNBC and they had General McCaffrey on with Steve Schmidt, who I actually just mentioned. And McCaffrey said he thinks that General Milley will be judged very kindly by history. And Steve Schmidt said this was all, justified. His implication was that, in fact, it was heroic because Donald Trump should have been thrown out by the 25th Amendment. I think he said something to the extent that, every reasonable justification for invoking the 25th Amendment was met by Donald Trump. And that's the context that this is written in the book, that, Trump was allegedly, according to the Woodward sourcing, just all over the place, unpredictable. And, that's why he needed this check from Milley. Milley felt he needed to, go. And there's a not insignificant chance that Milley is the one who leaked it in this framing. And that's another thing to remember. So this is not to put a underscore on Josh's point. This is getting close to something very, very immediate and very, very dangerous, that because you can have one of the top cable networks have a general and have someone who used to be, such a respected figure in politics for no good reason, really, like Steve Schmidt come out and all agree that this was not problematic. This was heroic. I mean, the only person who disagreed with them really was like Vindman right? Like,
Yeah.
like Vindman was like, this is crazy. So it just seems like the consensus is more and more.
You've jumped the shark when Alexander Vindman is like, no, that's treason.
Listen. So yeah, it's getting very dangerous.
I think as of now, based on the full context and body of reporting that we've seen, plus the non-denial of the alleged comments put out by a spokesperson for General Milley, if we assume it to all be true, worth noting, by the way, in that statement that he also implicates the interagency as well as the Department of Defense, and the Secretary of Defense himself at the time, then Secretary Esper, has also been implicated in this. There's a question of how many other people at the table knew or were participating or were endorsing and consenting to these sorts of comments being made. Basically, Mark Milley usurped the power of the presidency and with it subverted the will of the American people, period, full stop. The question of whether it will meet the definition of treason or not almost seems to be secondary at this point, because you can't even get all of Congress to demand that at very minimum, he be fired, which I don't think would be adequate punishment for what he did in providing, in effect, aid and comfort to China. I mean, China, let's just think about that scenario where it appeared that there was going to be a strike on China and he calls up his counterpart and keeps him abreast of what's about to take place. Think about all the steps that China would take in the time that the strike was being contemplated to move its assets out of the way, to prepare to counterstrike against America. It's incalculable, the damage, when you really start to think it through and play out that scenario, beyond, of course, breaking rank and what it means when your senior most officers are subverting a president. This would be totally inconceivable at any other time in history, but based upon everything that we've witnessed in the last 4+ years, this is just the cherry on top of a series of acts that would have seemed unprecedented. And I guess there's a question of, has it always been like this? Or was it to an unprecedented degree under Trump? And we also got unprecedented visibility into it. And that leads me to my last point, which is that if it was Milley or his confidants who leaked this, think about the fact that why they would have leaked it. They must have felt that they would be celebrated for the acts that they took. And that is the ultimate FU to the American people, that our ruling class does not care about your consent. All they care about is their power and privilege at the end of the day, which was threatened by a President Trump. And it caused them to act in the most authoritarian fashions and to engage in the ultimate massive projection in terms of their attacks on President Trump versus the acts that they undertook to subvert him and ultimately subvert and undermine the American people and all of our institutions. So I can't hold back my contempt and disgust at this. I've been writing on this theme for several years, and this just seems to be the apotheosis of it. And by the way, one last little ancillary point. General Milley, based upon prior reporting earlier in the summer, it appeared was very afraid that President Trump would initiate an attack on Iran late in his presidency. So I want to know, was he also back channeling and freelancing with the Millocracy as well? Something worth investigating.
So I guess, and this can be my final thought before we go around the room, but I guess like where I think about this story, this issue, and then even the issue that Emily brought up in the first segment about OSHA and, so the administrative state, it's like, how does the right respond to this? Because it's almost like we're fighting on two different planes, right? The right has appeals to the Constitution and like shrinking the administrative state and like Congress should act. Again, all of these things are like almost incredibly normative. They're like quaint at this point, right? And then you have the left over here who's like, haha, Constitution, I'm the captain now, right? Like they have no intention of abiding by this sort of rule of law structure that the right has put in place. So how does the right respond when you are fighting an adversary that doesn't even recognize your terms at this point, right? It's like and institutionally, I think we are somewhat unprepared for it. Like you have, again, this awful example of Milley in the White House, again, really undermining one of the sacred principles of what this country was founded on. And you can't get anybody in Congress to even do anything except issue maybe like a strongly worded press release, and that's it. So I guess not to leave us in like a dark place, but I do think that there needs to be some fresh thinking about how we deal with this, because we are not fighting an adversary that agrees with us on anything. And I think all of our institutions are built around this idea of a country that or a left anyway, that doesn't exist in the way it did in our minds. So I just put that out there for anyone listening who's younger and wants to come up and solve these problems. Feel free, because the olds need some help.
Well, I'll just add to that as we get into final thoughts here that what Rachel said, I think about the Department of Education, and we have an infrastructure of the conservative movement that has been built up around this normative and I think romantic idea of our government and our Constitution, which deserves some romance. I mean, it's beautiful. It's the greatest government in the history of the world. But that doesn't mean, I mean, in this moment, that's not the solution, right? Like that is not going to get us out of anything, comma, David French. That is not how we sort of escape this moment. That's not to say you burn the Constitution. No, not at all. We still should adhere to our values as a country, but it is to say that like part of this is just like admitting you have a problem. You know, like first step is admitting you have a problem. And I think a huge part of the solution is just being aware that there is this latent power in our bureaucracy, that there's this latent, and I mean, it's not even latent in the culture, it's being exercised every single day. We're sort of in that right now. Like this is the emergency time where you have the political establishment supporting a coup and not even really realizing it. And if they are realizing it, they're sort of happy to embrace that. So when you have that happening, this is an emergency. And I think we just need to be prepared, less in a sort of like 30,000 foot broad view, but on a case by case basis, to realize the level of power that's being exerted over us by a small concentration of people.
So, yeah, this is a great final thought segment. I mean, it's kind of like the leitmotifs that we touch on almost every week, but it's good to kind of just further the conversation here. So, you know, to again borrow one of our favorite terms, it kind of, to me, always comes back to understanding what time it is, right? And I attribute that quote mostly to my good friend Dave Rioboy. It's become something of kind of like a recurring meme in right-wing Twitter at this point. And I think back a little bit, you know, I worked at the Daily Wire for a little over a year. I think before I worked there, if I remember correctly, Ben Shapiro wrote a piece at National Review. I think it was a National Review, basically contra owning the libs. It was like against owning the libs. Michael Knowles responded at Daily Wire, I think, like in favor of owning the libs. It was kind of a precursor, if you will, to the Amari French debate in kind of like a slightly separate sense. That debate was very prescient here. And I think that there obviously, back in the 2016 Republican presidential primary, I think that like there were a lot of people, right, who I thought that capital C conservative, capital P principle still could be the thing that could ultimately save the republic. It's very difficult now, 5 years after the 2016 presidential election, to think that that is the case. Maybe that is going to be what redeems us like 100, 150 years from now. But first, we need to like make sure the country does not fracture and just completely obliterate and fall apart in the next 20 years, honestly, if we're probably being a little more black-pilled about what's actually going on in this country right now. So at least in the short to medium term, at least, let's hold aside kind of like long-term restorative projects here. At least in the short to medium term, we just have to be more willing to kind of get in there and get our hands a little dirty, right? And that plays out in big tech. It plays out in CRT. It plays out in the vaccine mandates here. But if you actually view this kind of wokest ruling class in both the public and private sector context as just trying to subjugate us, as just not caring, you know, my most recent piece for Claremont's American Mind website, it was kind of like about the eviction moratorium and this Biden Department of Labor thing. The subhead that I didn't choose, one of the editors there chose, the subhead read, "They know it's illegal, they just don't care." And that's what's going on here, people. Like people, not like the three of you, but like the audience, like they don't care. They do not care. So we can, again, like fight with one hand tied behind our back in David French's fashion, appealing to quote unquote principle all we damn want. We're not going to get anywhere against an adversary that is just completely untethered to anything whatsoever, except for the pursuit of power, qua power, and a kind of Nietzschean will to power desire to subjugate us. So sorry for the rant. Didn't really intend to kind of go off like that here, but understanding again what time it is, like what Emily said, understanding the imperative of the moment, that again is the first step to a longer term project. But let's get out of this morass first, then talk about bringing back in principle, constitutionalism, and so forth to kind of save this entire edifice.
Well, woke General Milley and now potentially treasonous General Milley, or at least plotting to commit what would be a treasonous offense, Milley, talked about the imperative to understand white rage. And I think this is something I'm going to write up, but my response to General Milley is, it's important that we train and we understand, and I want to understand ruling class rage. So what is it that caused thousands of people like General Milley to assault the White House and try to overturn the Constitution of the United States of America? What caused that? I want to find that out. And I think the answer to that, incidentally, is very clear. Whether we're talking about generals subverting a president or we're talking about vaccine mandates, it is ultimately that the ruling class believes it is right. And as a consequences of it being right, it has not only an obligation, it has a responsibility to impose that upon you for your own good. Now, of course, it always accrues to the good ultimately of the ruling class itself, because the ruling class cares most about augmenting its power and privilege in perpetuity. And I think that's where we are today. In fact, I would say, we talk about, is it going to collapse 20 years down the road, or 50 or 100 or 150? And what about China and all of this and beyond? I think that we live in a fundamentally different country today than we lived in 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago, and clearly beyond that as well. I think it would be inconceivable that you talk about shutting down a country essentially from normalcy for months on end perpetually, the censorship, the pervasive creepiness in terms of the use of public and private power to go after dissenters and beyond. I think we're already there. So I agree. I don't have the answer yet to how do you fight in a situation where the other side is completely unconstrained in the political and information and beyond warfare that they're engaging in to try to usurp total power. But it is still clear that not enough people know it. Clearly, our purported political representatives don't get it. And it's demonstrated time and time again, just like in this Milley situation, where you only have a few people speaking out and issuing words. And look at the other side. The other side runs roughshod over those press releases time and time again. So I don't have the answer, but I completely agree. It is about knowing what time it is. It is about knowing the stakes. And Molly Hemingway, in that address, she talked about the fact that it's not about standing athwart history yelling stop at this point, or move accelerate into demise at a slower rate. Ultimately, it's about being counter-revolutionary. And I think that is really where we have to be at this point. We're not conserving anything. Ultimately, everything that we care to conserve is being eviscerated. So it's about, what do you do the day after that? And it starts with understanding that we are at that point. And hopefully we've shed some light on that in this and other episodes.
Well, on behalf of Ben, Emily, Josh, and myself, I'm Rachel Bovard, and we'll see you on the next NatCon Squad.